Hi everyone, this is Neil Malik from Knack Training, bringing you Everyday Office video number 4, the Pivot Table Fundamentals in Microsoft Excel. So I'm coming at this assuming that a lot of you haven't built your first pivot table before, and I'd like to show you how and why we build them. So in basically every business on the face of the earth, there are these big lists of information. And those lists might be in databases, they might be in spreadsheets, they might get sent to you off of a website. And these are things like what you've sold and who your customers are and who your employees are and what your office locations are and the vehicles that you drive at your business. Basically, there are lists of all these different pieces of information. But a list, like this one right here of all your employees, doesn't actually do anything for you yet. It's important to be able to squeeze something useful out of this list. So you can see in this list that we have everybody who works in the same state and everybody who works in the same office and everybody who works in the same department, and then we have their salaries, and it's very likely that it would be useful to have a report that told you how many employees worked in every office, or told you what the average salary of somebody who worked in human resources was. And that's exactly why you make pivot tables. When you are given big long lists of information like this one, we can create a pivot table like this that quickly summarizes the total salary, the number of employees, the average salary, the average revenue, any piece of information within that list that you might think of squeezing out of it. So this is the pivot table part of things, and then of course the very nice thing to be able to do is then create a pivot chart that's connected to the pivot table and to be able to see graphically how things are stacking up within your business. And so we can apply this to basically any facet of your business. As you can see here, I've decided to create a tab on the source data tab that is related to the expenses that a business has. And you can see that those expenses have different types, whether we're buying legal services or whether we're buying gas or printing. They have dates associated with those expenses, so maybe I might be interested in every expense in the first quarter or the second quarter. They have the department that's associated, the office that's associated with those expenses, and then we have the amount of those expenses. So we could see asking ourselves how many expenses were there in each of the different quarters, what was the total expense by department, what was the average expense by account. Any of those things might be useful information to have. So when we're given a big list of information like this one, we click onto that big list of information, go to the Insert tab at the top of the screen, and Pivot Table is the very first button over on the left-hand side. So we're generating a new report, a new summary based off of this source data, allowing us to figure out what's useful, what's important or interesting within the business. I click on Pivot Table and it asks me two pieces of information. The first is where are the cells that have this expense data in it, and you can see here it properly selected A3 through G3047. And the second question is where should we put this report? And as you can see down here at the bottom, I've created a tab called Report. I'm going to go ahead and choose Existing Worksheet and pick that location. Go to the Report tab and maybe just put that in cell A3. Then click OK. And at this point we have a new blank pivot table. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have the different columns from our expenses. You can remember this from just a second ago. We had the account name, the expense date, the department, the office, and the subtotal of the amount that we paid for that expense. Below that, we have 4 different boxes, one for filters, one for columns, one for rows, and one for values. The 2 most important boxes in this panel are the 2 bottom ones, values and rows. As you can see, the values here has a little sigma icon next to it. That's letting you know that this is where the calculations happen. So for example, if I wanted to total up all of the subtotals, watch how easy this is. I click the checkbox for subtotal, and because Excel assumes that the subtotal, being a numeric value, needs to be added up, it automatically adds that to the values box. And just like that, I can see the grand total of all the expenses we paid. It's not formatted yet, but we'll come back to that in just a second. And if we want to be able to see that broken down by department, for example, I can click the checkbox for department. And because department is a text-based field, there are different names of departments, it automatically put department into the rows field, which, as you can see, what it does is it breaks down the subtotal by department. Now, the very first time I ever taught a class about making pivot tables, there was a person in that class who raised their hand and they said, why do they call it a pivot table? And I had to be honest, I had no idea why they call it a pivot table. So I went and looked it up later, and the reason they call it a pivot table is because let's say that we no longer care about the total expense by department. I might uncheck the checkbox for department and check the checkbox for office, for example. And now we have the total expenses by which office people worked in. But if I don't care about subtotals anymore, or let's say the grand total of the subtotal, maybe I want to know the average expense. I can go to my values box down here at the bottom, click the little drop-down menu, and choose value field settings. This allows me to tweak how this box works. I go to value field settings and I say, maybe I want to know the average. So I'll choose average here. I'll put in that I'm looking for the AVG expense. And what's more, I can click on number format down here at the bottom, and I can make this into an accounting format. Click OK, and click OK. And just like that, I have the average expense by department, or excuse me, by office. And if I no longer care about it based off the office that we're talking about, I might uncheck office and check the checkbox for account name, for example. And now I know the average expense by the type of expense we're talking about. So it's this ability to pivot this report from one piece of information to another, from one important element to another, from one calculation to another, is why it's called a pivot table. Let me swing back around to department here. And now if I'm interested in which department has the highest average expense, I can click into this column right here, go to my data tab at the top of the screen, and sort it Z to A. And you can see here that production is the highest average expense of all the departments. And that's why you use pivot tables. It's the ability to see different pieces of information calculated, and then the breakdown of that calculation by the department, by the region, by the date, by any piece of information that's relevant to you, and then be able to present that. Let's say that now I wanted to make this really obvious for my coworkers. What I could do is I can go up to the Analyze tab at the top of the screen. And the Analyze tab that's associated with this pivot table gives me lots of different options here. But let's just focus on, for the moment, the ability to chart. I'll click on Pivot Chart right here. And you can see here, I've got my clustered column chart. I'll go ahead and click OK. And I can sort of line this up side by side. Now, what if I wanted to, let's go ahead and take some of the stuff off of here so we have more space to work with. You see here that I was clicking on things like these entries over here on the side and just using the delete key. But another thing that we can do, these gray boxes that are here, I can simply go to the Analyze tab at the top of the screen and deselect the Field Buttons button. And as you can see, those gray boxes leave. So this is pretty good. Maybe I want to take a second here and change it from average to total. I'll go here to the drop-down menu, go to Value Field Settings, and switch it back to Sum, and maybe call this Total Expenses. And as you can see there, marketing represents almost $3.5 million of expenses, and it's the biggest bar here, and it's the first bar in the column chart. Pretty nice. So it's this ability to visualize, to analyze different things at a moment's notice that makes a pivot table so valuable to basically every business in the entire world. Because anybody who runs a business needs to know what's happening inside that business. So after this, there are going to be a lot more video tutorials about how to work with pivot tables. There are so many different customizations and fun tricks that you can do. Make sure to subscribe to this channel to see those as they come out.